All right. Well, thank you again for the introduction and also for the invitation. It's a great joy to be with you today. And I'm actually going to talk about the use of technology to promote aging in place and look at some of the challenges and opportunities we have with emerging technologies, both for gerontology in general, but also more specifically for dementia care. With this new era of aging that we're all facing, with changing demographics, the workforce shortage, we have to come up with new innovative tools to address perhaps some of the growing challenges, especially as a large segment of the population wants to age in place and stay independent at home for as long as possible, rather than change residence every time their healthcare needs change. So that's why we're looking at technology, and this fits in the context of precision health or precision medicine, which calls for collecting and analyzing large data that are collected based on an individual's behavior, lifestyle, genetics, and environmental context. So with precision medicine, we're trying to understand the unique profile of an individual, not just at the clinical side, but in their daily living, in the environment they find themselves in, as well as their genetic profile. And here's where technology can play a role, and more specifically, behavioral sensing. When we talk about behavioral sensing, we're mostly talking about passive monitoring and wearable technologies. So passive monitoring, as opposed to active monitoring, is the kind of technology that can be in the background. So you don't actually have to learn to operate any hardware or software. For example, the motion sensors that the doors in the grocery store have are a passive monitoring technology. They detect that somebody's moving towards the door and the door opens. And the reason why passive monitoring may have some potential, especially in the space of aging and dementia care, is because it doesn't really provide a solution for monitoring that doesn't require active operation. And similarly with wearable technologies, we see a lot of growth in that space, where now we have many commercially available wearable watches or other devices that capture a plethora of physiological and behavioral variables. The purpose of behavioral sensing is to objectively, remotely, and continuously measure aspects of patient physiology, behavior, and symptoms. So the benefits we see from behavioral sensing using things like sensors in the home or other technologies, and I'll provide some examples of those later on, is that we have the opportunity to capture behavior and activities of daily living without having to rely on human observers or self-report. A typical example in this is when we're trying to track sleep quality. When we have people fill out sleep diaries, there's always a challenge. There might be a lack of adherence, people are not filling those journals out, or in some cases they tend to over or under-report their sleep quality or the hours that they slept. Here we're talking about monitoring that's more objective, as it's based on technology that works in the background and shifts from episodic to continuous monitoring. We're measuring people's behaviors in the real world and not in a laboratory, so more likely to identify challenges or patterns that are part of daily living. And also the idea with all these technologies is not that you would have a human at the other end watching the data points come in real time and have to deal with the data, but rather that we develop intelligent algorithms that can extract information, make inferences by identifying events, trends, and patterns based on these large data sets. And the goal with that is to shift from a reactive to a proactive model. So rather than waiting for an adverse event to occur and then having to deal with the implications and the side effects, we're hoping to identify problems before they become adverse events, certain trends or patterns that will help us intervene at an earlier time. So in this category of behavioral sensing, we see an emerging trend that is becoming more and more popular in the gerontology space, which is that of a smart home. A smart home is defined as a residence with embedded technology that will facilitate passive monitoring of the residents with a goal to improve their safety, well-being, and independence. The term smart homes was used in the 80s to refer to energy efficient buildings, but it became pretty clear soon thereafter that some of the same technologies like motion sensors, gate sensors, heat sensors can actually play a role in health monitoring as well. And thus we use the term smart home quite a bit now in the gerontology space to refer to those intelligent, if you will, residential settings that can promote aging in place. So when we think about smart homes, we can think about even commercially available solutions, door and window sensors. So here you see some examples from a real residence as well as from our laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania. So door and window sensors can tell you when the door has been opened or closed, when the cupboard or the refrigerator door has been opened and closed. Motion sensor tells you when there's motion in the room. There's gate monitors and bed sensors that can give you information about sleep quality. And again, it's more about creating the right algorithm. So it's not so much about the individual time point when somebody opened the door, but rather this information can give us more knowledge about how much time somebody's spending inside the home versus outside, whether they're more sedentary or more active, whether they're having visitors or not, sleeping well at night or having sleep interruptions, bathroom visits, how much time they're engaging in daily hygiene or meal preparation. And again, with a further goal, not to identify the daily profile, but to identify when there seems to be a deviation from what would be the normal pattern for a specific resident. We've done quite a few smart home projects where we try to deploy different types of sensors in residential settings and retirement communities. And we gather this information in terms of, with the hopes of identifying certain patterns and intervening earlier, as I mentioned before. So what we hope to do with this work is also to find ways to visualize that information in a way that makes sense to not only the researchers and clinicians, but also to older adults and their family members too. And that is actually quite a challenge because visualizing large data sets needs to acknowledge that the different stakeholders have different information needs, meaning that a clinician wants to see more aggregate level data and not necessarily detailed granular level data in terms of daily activity. Sometimes our participants want to see the day-to-day activity and be able to annotate this information. Similarly, family members who can access the same portal might want to see different information depending on whether they want to just quickly check if their loved one is doing well or get more information about the daily routines of their loved one. Visualizing this information is really key in terms of highlighting that new knowledge that's generated from smart homes. So here's an example of a graph that we use quite a bit that's called density map. And a density map showcases the firings of those motion sensors in a day. So in the graph, you can see, for example, on the left side, a graph that has on the x-axis the hours in a day, and the y-axis are the days in the month. The color spectrum represents the motion firings. So black means that the resident is not inside the apartment. White means that they're inside, but there's no motion sensor firings. And then light gray all the way to dark blue indicates the level of motion within an hour in that apartment. Dark blue would indicate quite a bit of motion, somebody moving up and down and walking up and down rapidly. So what you see here, and those are based on real residents, on the left side is a resident who has a somewhat regular pattern in their daily activities. You can see that during the night, they are not moving around much because they're sleeping, and they usually tend to wake up around 6:30 or 7 a.m., and there's some movement then. They leave their apartment around 8, and that's because they usually go for breakfast in the dining area of the retirement community. They come back to their apartment, and then most of the days in the month go for lunch around noon. They come back at 1. They move around quite a bit, but not too much inside the apartment, and then they go out around 6 p.m. for dinner. The same resident a year later shows the density map that you can see on the right. And now you can see that the resident actually doesn't show the same patterns and regularity in their daily living. They move around more in late hours. There's even one day where they left the apartment at midnight. There's more movement between midnight and 3 a.m. They tend to sleep maybe more into 8 or 9 a.m. They leave the apartment sometimes. They're pretty consistent about dinner, so they still go to the dining area between 6 and 7 p.m., but then they come home, they leave the apartment again. What you see here is something that it was the profile of a resident who had no other data that would alarm the family members, the clinicians, or the facility. The community nurse who visits every 6 months found no difference in vital signs like blood pressure or glucose levels and so forth. And the residents also got to engage with the resident at dinner, which the person was attending regularly. So there was not necessarily a need for concern. But when you actually look at these density maps, you do clearly see that there is a change in people's daily living. And this was actually a true case of a person who was starting to experience some cognitive decline, and that was manifested in this type of data, perhaps sooner than when some other type of adverse event would have occurred to lead to a more thorough examination. There's a lot of literature on smart homes that show quite a lot of evidence in simple things like urinary tract infection when you use motion sensors or bed sensors, and you suddenly have a resident who goes from 3 bathroom visits at night to 7 or 8 bathroom visits at night. That's another easy way to identify an abnormality or a pattern that could actually prevent an unnecessary hospitalization. Obviously, you could even identify patterns of social isolation and loneliness, or even some emergencies, depending on the types of technologies that are used. For example, when somebody has fallen and they're not moving for quite some time, or somebody's not waking up within the normal or the expected time range, depending on what you have entered as the normal range for that resident in the system, or when somebody leaves their apartment and wanders but has not returned back. And for these wandering behaviors, there's quite a lot of motion sensors that are currently used in a lot of facilities that combine door and window sensors to identify when somebody, for example, leaves their unit and is not coming back, or left the unit and left the door open, and so forth. So these different types of technologies can actually be used to mostly monitor long-term trends and patterns, but in some cases may be useful even for immediate detection of emergencies or some other types of threats to a resident's safety. There are many smart home initiatives. In the research space, the University of Missouri has created the Center for Elder Care and Rehabilitation Technology, and they have done quite a lot of work in smart homes. They have a facility called Tiger Place, which is an aging in place retirement community, and all the apartments are wired with smart home sensors. And they have been doing this work for several years now. So they have significantly advanced our understanding of what smart home technologies can do. There is a Smart Home Research Initiative at Penn State in Harrisburg, and similarly, they're looking at deploying smart home solutions. Those are just some of the examples of many national initiatives. And as I mentioned, there's not just academic research projects, but also commercially available solutions. Some of them are focusing mostly on a combination of different types of sensors that when used in a facility or in a home can provide alerts and graphical representation of a person's activities of daily living. I'm going to talk about a project we have ongoing right now at the University of Pennsylvania. That's also another smart home initiative that we call Sense for Safety. This project is a technology-enhanced fall risk assessment and fall prevention intervention for socially vulnerable older adults with mild cognitive impairment. So basically here we're looking specifically at the use of smart home technologies for fall prevention and targeting people with mild cognitive impairment who want to stay independent and safe in their home. We are looking at falls because it's a significant challenge in the gerontology space, and mild cognitive impairment and housing conditions are each independent risk factors for multiple falls, and cognitive impairment is a leading risk factor for falls in older adults. When you see the statistics, over 60% of older adults with mild cognitive impairment will fall annually 2 to 3 times the rate of those without cognitive impairment. And then we're also looking at socially vulnerable older adults because housing conditions are also risk factors, and older adults living in low resource neighborhoods with poor housing conditions have twice the risk of falling. So what is Sense for Safety? We're trying to use technology to link an older adult who is at risk with a coach who will guide them in implementing a specific tailored plan to reduce fall risks. The technology will be used to identify escalating risks for falls real time through this monitoring. And our system employs machine learning to inform individualized plans to reduce fall risk. The technology we use is a depth sensor, like the one you can see in the picture here. And that's the type of sensor that basically creates silhouette extractions and allows you to calculate gait characteristics. So basically, our system, when installed in the home, can extract from these silhouette movements speed, gait speed, stride length, and other gait characteristics that let us calculate a fall risk score for that individual. We have a first visit where the nurse goes in with a technician, and the nurse performs an environmental scan to identify any fall risk hazards in the home and suggests modifications that could be low cost or easy fixes that can reduce fall risk inside the home. At the same time, the technician installs the depth sensor, usually in the living room, and then the nurse does some baseline assessments. Once the depth sensor starts collecting data, the nurse can see these changes in fall risk over time and discusses this and other information with the resident every 2 weeks. She has access to a dashboard that provides this fall risk information. If a fall gets detected, she receives an alert, and it will have a recording of the last 30 seconds prior to the fall, so she can confirm if it's a false positive or true positive by looking at that silhouette extraction video of the individual. The dashboard that the nurse uses basically includes all the information about stride length, average speed, stride time, and all the gait alerts that may have been generated for this individual patient in any given time. Usually we can select if it's the last week, the last 2 weeks, or the last month. And that's the information that's used for the nurse to coach the resident in individualized exercise programs. We use the Otago exercise intervention, and so the nurse can direct residents to simple solutions in terms of identifying and addressing a potential increase in the fall risk, or just make sure that everything is going well. In many cases, the resident chooses to have a family member or trusted other be part of those coaching sessions that happen over phone or over Zoom or other video conferencing solutions. The idea here with the gait information that's generated from the depth sensor is that you can actually create a tailored intervention. The system becomes better over time as it actually becomes an ongoing learning system, and can become more accurate over time and help the coach propose specific and individualized interventions. The goal is to prevent the fall before it happens, rather than have to deal with the fall after it happens. And the combination of the technology and the personalized intervention is hopefully one that will address fall prevention in a more comprehensive way. In addition to these technologies I mentioned that focus mostly on overall well-being or fall risk, or in some cases looking at overall mobility and decline in mobility for residents. There's also different projects that use smart home technologies to specifically address social isolation. And here we see efforts to create smart communities to promote engagement. Again, we can use passive sensing in the home to identify when residents spend more time alone, when they have fewer visitors, when they're perhaps spending most of their time inside versus outside. And this can be information that can be useful at the community level too, more from a public health perspective, not just in terms of an individual resident, but when you have a community, you could look at overall social isolation patterns and whether there's opportunities through specific activities or other types of engagement initiatives to create more social connectedness for residents in a specific community that's being monitored. Other technologies are used in that space too. Conversational agents have become more popular. So conversational agents are chatbots or basically intelligent, if you will, conversation partners, just like Alexa or Siri, but designed specifically to engage people in conversations, for small talk, and promoting social engagement with a virtual friend. There have been studies that show that there is some benefit from virtual pets or virtual conversation partners, but again, those are mostly preliminary, and we definitely need more evidence and obviously more work in speech recognition and natural language processing to identify the opportunities that we might have with these types of solutions. When thinking about social isolation and loneliness, a lot of these initiatives enable what I mentioned earlier, a community level planning. So providing a snapshot of how members of a larger community, whether it's a retirement community or an assisted living community, can actually perhaps engage more with each other or with staff and volunteers based on passive sensing data that give you a better idea of how people spend their days. When we think about all these technologies that can be installed in the home, a lot of times people talk about passive sensing being an appropriate solution for older adults in the sense that you don't have to train anybody to use new technology, nor do you have to rely on them having the cognitive abilities or the experience to operate any technology. It works in the background. And while that is certainly an advantage, I think we need to think more holistically about the notion of technology and look at this concept of obtrusiveness, which is not just about privacy, even though that is a significant component, but rather a more summary evaluation by the user based on what characteristics or effects that are associated with the technology may be perceived by the user themselves as undesirable and physically or psychologically prominent. So we designed a framework for obtrusiveness for those types of home monitoring technologies to better understand all the different constructs that play a role in terms of how obtrusive or non-obtrusive a technology may be that we introduce in our homes. And here we have the physical dimension. What does it mean to have this technology installed in our homes? Some of the early smart home solutions actually had sensors that would hang from the ceiling and there would be cables. Now, obviously, a lot of this technology is much more, it's less obvious that you have smart home technology, and it's part of entertainment and security installations anyway. So it's not something necessarily different from what we already may have in our homes. We still have to address whether the technology creates discomfort or excessive noise or needs us to adjust our physical space to accommodate for the technology. And also the issue of aesthetics, especially when you bring a lot of sensors that are to be installed in people's walls. There's a usability dimension, especially when you have to interact with any interfaces like the dashboard I was mentioning earlier. Some smart home solutions have actually a dashboard for the residents themselves and for their loved ones. So how easy are those to use and access? The privacy dimension is key. And here we're not only talking about the technical specifications of the technology. A lot of times when we talk about smart home sensors, people talk about the secure server, the encrypted data exchange, which are all really important, but we also have to think about the subjective or lived experience of residents who have this specialized equipment in their homes, and whether they feel that this might invade their personal space, and especially because it is one of our most sacred spaces when it comes to privacy, which is our own home. We have to think about how the technology functions, whether it's accurate, reliable, and valid. For example, when you think about gate monitors or some of the smart carpets that have pressure sensors and weight sensors under the carpet so you can detect a fall, they tend to generate sometimes false positives. You drop the book, the system thinks you have fallen. There is a whole response mechanism that is set in motion. What is the financial but also emotional cost of false positives, or even worse, false negatives, when your system tells you everything's fine, but the resident, for example, has actually fallen or is in some other type of danger? Is the technology accurate and reliable? Does it need for us to change how we do things in order for the technology to function appropriately? And do people who use the technology in their home find it useful? Is that information actionable? For example, just because we can measure certain things about activities of daily living doesn't necessarily mean that we can do a lot about changing or addressing them. The human interaction dimension is also important in terms of understanding what the technology may introduce in terms of the human relationships. A lot of times people who participate in smart home projects or live in residential settings that have these types of capabilities worry that this might be a way to reduce in-person visits, or that loved ones would check that they're doing well remotely and not necessarily visit in person, or that they might see their clinicians less often. And we have to look at potential detrimental effects on those relationships. We need to examine the dimension of self-concept, what it means to have an environment with a lot of monitoring capabilities inside our homes, and whether that could mean a symbol of loss of independence for the resident, as well as cause of embarrassment or stigma. In a lot of our smart home studies, we do have residents in communities who will say that they agree to participate only if everybody else in the facility also has their sensors in their homes. Or, for example, if they're not the only ones who are participating, or if the system is not too visible to guests and friends because they don't want to appear as being frail or in need of additional monitoring. And that's also pretty consistent with some of the fall detection wearable devices that we saw a few years back when people were refusing to wear pendants or other solutions because of the stigmatizing features of having to wear some type of medical device. We have to think about how these technologies may interfere with people's daily routines and daily activities, and whether they have to acquire new rituals. That is, for example, the case with some of the systems for passive sensing for medication adherence, or when people have to do things differently inside their own home because of the technology that has been introduced. We need to think about also the sustainability of these solutions. People often are concerned whether they can afford the technologies and whether they could afford them in the future, especially if they learn to depend on a system that they in the future may not have access to. So thinking about the long-term sustainability of these solutions is an important element in this more comprehensive evaluation of both potential benefits and challenges with smart home solutions or any type of home monitoring solution to facilitate aging in place. I think we have to recognize that the technology is advancing rapidly, and we do see this domain growing a lot. And so we have to make sure that the ethical and legal considerations don't come as an afterthought, but rather that we become more proactive in the design of these systems. We have to think about health disparities and the fact that technology sometimes, even though designed to improve access, can in many cases exacerbate existing inequities. For example, some of the smart home solutions require existing broadband availability or Wi-Fi or some residential infrastructure that not necessarily all people have in their homes. In the Sense for Safety project, for example, we recruit low-income, socially vulnerable older adults, and our depth sensors also require Wi-Fi capabilities, which we provide to residents because it's part of our research project. But in the future, if this were to translate into the real world and daily practice, how would this cost be absorbed in a socially vulnerable community in terms of internet availability, for example, or even the cost of hardware that sometimes can be high. Many of the sensors I mentioned are really low cost, commercially available motion sensors, but there are some that are more expensive. And also it's not just the hardware, but oftentimes the infrastructure for data storage that can increase the cost. A really important challenge with these home monitoring technologies is the notion of informed consent. And I'm not only talking about informed consent for research study, but also for daily use in the real world. How can we make sure that people fully understand what they're signing up for? And that introduces many complexities because we're talking about technology that sometimes it's not easy to explain to a lay audience in terms of how the cloud works or what could be potential threats to data safety and what happens with data exchange and data ownership. But more so, how do we ensure that we respect the wishes of individuals who may not have full decisional capacity or are experiencing cognitive limitations, but we still want to make sure that we respect their autonomy and their wishes. There is need for patient education to help people navigate through these new complexities. And here we have to think not only in terms of literacy and health literacy, but also in terms of data literacy and graph literacy. So data literacy refers to one's ability to process concepts around data, data storage, data exchange, and similarly with graph literacy, one's ability to interpret data and extract information from visualizations and graphs. And our participants have varying degrees of literacy, data literacy, graph literacy. So how can we create solutions that can be more inclusive, allowing people to benefit from these technologies regardless of their own previous experience and familiarity with the technology? And recognizing that informed consent is not an event, but rather a process, we have to recognize also that people's lived experience may alter their overall perceptions of the technology. So people who in the beginning wanted to share their data with loved ones may later decide that this is actually something that they don't want to share. But that, as I mentioned, becomes more challenging when you have individuals who may be also experiencing a diminishing decisional capacity. How do we understand and solicit patient and family preferences, especially in terms of data sharing? A lot of our participants say it's really important to them that their son or daughter accesses the information. And then similarly, we have other participants who say, it should only be my clinician. I specifically don't want my family members to have this information. And these are technologies that do change the process of healthcare delivery because you have a person at the other end who's supposed to act on this information. And how do you really address this impact on their workflow? As I mentioned, the idea is not that you would have a clinician at the other end looking at the data in real time, but still somebody has to deal with the information that might be generated monthly or the alerts that the system triggers, and issues around accountability and liability with data sets that may contain information about a person's well-being need to be addressed. Who is responsible for the information that's hidden in these large data sets, and who is supposed to deal with the response based on whatever information is being conveyed. This also has introduced a discussion around the growth of personal patient-generated health data, things like the activity level information we get from our Fitbit, for example, or other wearables. Oftentimes people say, should that be part of the electronic medical record? And again, this introduces a lot of challenges because we don't always know the quality of the data that are generated. And we also don't know if they should be handled by the clinical formal systems of care and what the implications would be in terms of workflow and accountability, and the debate about whether patient-generated data belong in the electronic health record or not is ongoing as more consumer technologies become available, where an individual consumer has options to choose monitoring technologies about their well-being or the well-being of their loved one, regardless of what other data might be formally collected at points of care. A significant challenge we see in the space of smart homes is in terms of the misalignment of individual and family preferences. And that's something that I think is very common in this domain, because we oftentimes have family members who are out of concern pushing for more technologies to be installed in the home and having more monitoring, and often residents or older adults themselves not feeling comfortable with that level of monitoring. Or as I mentioned, similarly, when you have people with dementia, how do you honor what that person's wishes would have been in terms of the level of intrusiveness that these technologies introduce, while also recognizing the need to keep people safe and well and protect them from outside threats and risks, and help them age at the setting of their choice. And we also have an opportunity to enhance the social aspects of care, and think about smart home technologies looking at not just the more traditional clinical data that we have been collecting, but as I mentioned, we see now more and more solutions around social isolation or loneliness, and recognizing that this could be an opportunity to design more tailored services for social engagement of older adults. So the technology space keeps growing. And before I wrap up, I wanted to briefly mention about an initiative we have at the University of Pennsylvania. It's called Penn AI Tech. It's our artificial intelligence and technology collaboratory for healthy aging. And this is a large center that's funded by the National Institute on Aging. And we have a national pilot grant competition program where every year we fund projects that use technology. It can be artificial intelligence and or other technologies for healthy aging. And that means both the general aging group as well as the advanced Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. There's two cores, the aging and the ADRD core. And the pilots can come from academia, industry, or clinical systems. It's usually small one-year projects for up to $250,000. But this is part of NIA's commitment to accelerate innovation in the space of technology and aging, and look at solutions that may actually make an impact in people's lives. So our collaboratory has a series of resources, including a clinical validation core, an ethics core, a technology selection core that helps the pilot awardees to pursue their one-year project with collaboration and mentoring from the collaboratory. Our next call for proposals will be out in September. So if you or any of your own members of your own network are interested, I would love to chat with you more. This is an initiative we're very excited about because it allows for both industry and academia and clinical systems to accelerate some of the innovation that is happening in this space. There's a lot of work going on in terms of technology and aging. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a unique opportunity to be more methodical and more thoughtful about how we integrate technology, because technology itself is not going to be the solution for the problems we face with aging, but it can be one of the tools that potentially can become a platform for any interventional solution we come up with. And as many opportunities as we see with technology, we also see challenges, and having those addressed early on is important. And finally, I'll conclude with that by making the point that one thing we see over and over again is the importance of engaging older adults and their families in system design at very early stages. It's unfortunate how many even commercially available systems we have in the space of fall detection or even blood pressure cuffs or regular monitoring devices that never included older adults in the testing. Many companies will use stunt actors for fall detection, or they will use healthy volunteers and college students for testing interfaces for devices, but then they're marketed specifically to a population that may have its own set of needs and preferences. And similarly, we're making assumptions about people's lives and preferences without having older adults and their families at the table. So I'm hoping this trend we see more with inclusive design that allows older adults and families to become partners and co-creators in these initiatives will actually facilitate that shift towards more inclusive and accessible technology.